Welcome to the last lecture for week 3 on the book of Sirach. So we have talked a lot about the early Hellenistic period and apocalyptic literature, but Sirach as well is a response to Hellenism. So both of these very different writings are a reaction to Hellenism and the influence or the pressure of Hellenism on the Jewish culture. So whereas apocalyptic is very suspicious of all things Greek and kind of go for this very dramatic understanding of history, Sirach is actually a quite positive, or has a very positive view of Greek culture and actually engages with it in some pretty direct ways. And actually, you could say that the goal of the book of Sirach is to prove that true wisdom comes from Jerusalem. True wisdom comes from Jerusalem, not from Athens. So the source of true wisdom is the Jewish God, and the Jewish culture, not Athens and the Greek culture. So that really is, so it actively engages some of the values of Hellenism, but says that actually the Jewish God is superior. The Jewish God has a broader understanding of true wisdom, or the Jewish people. So first of all, and I have implied this, but Sirach is a book of wisdom. That is its genre, and it falls directly in line with books like Proverbs. It reads a lot like Proverbs, not at all like Job or Ecclesiastes. So we call this traditional wisdom. And like I said, if you've read Proverbs, you understand it. And I've talked a little earlier in the semester about what wisdom is, but in its written form, it's often collections of not parables, but of proverbs, for the name, proverbs, hymns, sometimes what we might in the modern world call essays on chokmah, if you remember that word, to be skilled. So all of this is advice and discussions on how to live a good life. So, to be skilled at living. And as I said earlier, wisdom was very international. So, wisdom as a genre is probably the most international of all the genres that we'll find, all the theologies and the ways of approaching the world. And we find a lot of wisdom in Egypt. So we get to the location of the final form of Sirach. It all sorts of ties together. That here in the land of ancient wisdom, in the face of Hellenistic culture, Sirach and the translator engage in international wisdom to prove, again, the goal that true wisdom, and this is, and I'll talk about this term in a minute, but true wisdom is the fear of the Lord, as in the Jewish God. So, let us then look at the book of Sirach itself. Sirach is its Greek name. So let's start with the issue of names. This is the Greek. The Hebrew would probably have been more just very close to it, Sirach. But this book also in the church, because this is an important book in the early church, its Latin name is Ecclesiasticus. So close to Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiasticus, which means the church book, and it's a way of saying naming it as such is a way of saying that it is useful. It is a useful book for the church and has authority in the church. Those are the sort of the implications of calling it the church book. Useful and having authority. So where's the name? It probably goes under more different names than definitely than the average biblical text book, but that's because it just gets referred to. Just pick what language. It's all got titles in different languages. So authorship, and when I try and focus on individual books in any class, but is to talk about what we can know about the book, to start off with that. So in terms of authorship, this book is very Hellenistic because it gives us a great deal of information about the author. And this is not common practice in Hebraic literature. So as it is presented in the prologue, it is the wisdom of a man named Sirach, whose grandson, whose name in Greek is Jesus, or Jesus, ben, or son of Eleazar, ben Sirach. So the grandson. So Jesus, son of Eleazar, son of Sirach. So the author is a man named Sirach, and the translator then is his grandson. So and this definitely tells us that this book then is for the diaspora. Book for the diaspora, for the Jews who are living in places like Egypt. And if you look at the prologue, and if you need to pause for a second, there's so much that I want to skip around so much in the book of Sirach that I think that it would be good if you just had a copy, had it open next to you. So it is, again, this attribution to this man who lived in Jerusalem. It also says, so what we know about Sirach is that he lived in Jerusalem. He was described as a wise man, which is much more of a title in the ancient world than it is today. It usually implies some form of being a teacher or an advisor to the court. And it does indeed say in this book that Sirach ran a school in Jerusalem. And this is really the oldest mention of schools in any biblical material. Whereas we assume that they existed, it is only in this book from the Second Temple period that we get an actual reference to a school being run in Jerusalem. So this is who the author is, and then, like I said, his grandson moves to Egypt and translates the wisdom of this great Jewish scholar for the Greek-speaking Jews of the diaspora. So, what do we know? Then let's look at the prologue. The prologue has no numbers to it, but it actually has some really interesting information. So if we begin, many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophets and the others that followed them. Now, one of the first pieces of information that the prologue gives us really doesn't have as much to do with Sirach as it just has to do with our understanding of the Old Testament in general. This is one of the oldest references to a threefold division of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible. So if you remember from your Old Testament class, you have the Torah or the law, the Nevi'im or the prophets. We do know that this is one of the many pieces of evidence that leads us to the belief that the first two parts of the Hebrew Bible were coming into their final form in the Second Temple period. But here, and another major reference to the threefold division of the Bible is actually found in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus talks about the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Here in this case, this talks about the other writings. And so if you remember the threefold division, the Ketuvim, or the writings section, has yet to come into its final form. And like I said, in Luke 24, Jesus talks about the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. So this, again, another indication that this third part hadn't come into final form. So this is interesting in a larger perspective than just the book of Sirach, this early mention of the threefold division, and therefore the knowledge that at this point at least two parts of the what became the scripture of the Old Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, is coming into form, final form. So it, again, very clearly goes on to indicate its orientation to the Jews of the diaspora. So we should praise Israel for instruction and wisdom. Now those who read the scriptures must not only themselves understand them, but must also, as lovers of learning, be able, through the spoken and written word, to help the outsiders. So again, some level of this, so the first thing was the threefold division. The goal of providing the book to the Jewish community is to, in some ways, act as witness to the Gentile world. Again, the idea that the wisdom of Jerusalem is greater than the wisdom of Athens. So it is a defense of, in many ways, an apology, is the fancy term, operates as a written defense of the Jewish faith. So, again, that aspect of it. So then, my grandfather Jesus, Jesus, who had devoted himself especially to the reading of the law and the prophets, and other books of our ancestors, had acquired considerable proficiency, and was himself also led to write something pertaining to instruction and wisdom. Then, to skip to the next paragraph, you are invited, therefore, to read it with good will and attention, and to be indulgent in cases where, despite our diligent labor in translating, we may seem to have rendered some phrases imperfectly. So he goes on, after he introduces his grandfather, to to talk about the problems of translation. And I wish that a lot of that a lot of just translations of the entire Bible would come with this kind of caveat or warning. It says that that you may seem to have rendered some phrases imperfectly, for what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have exactly the same sense when translated into another language. Not only this book, but even the law itself and the prophets, the prophecies and the rest of the books differ not a little when read in the original. So there is sort of a warning about the Septuagint and a reminder, that, our origins are Hebrew. For those who are reading this book. Then it sort of, I'm counting the elements or the things that I want to point out to you. So if that helps, I hope so. But then the next paragraph talks about the process of translation for this particular book. So what it says is, when I came to Egypt in the 38th year of the reign of Euergetes. So, Euergetes, who was Pharaoh over Egypt. Basically, this gives us this date. He began his reign in 170. You subtract 38 years, and you have 132 BCE, which isn't the date of the immigration of this man. We don't know exactly when he actually made the translation, though. So as when I came in, it was the 38th year of the reign of Euergetes, and I stayed for some time. I found opportunity for no little instruction. It seemed highly necessary that I should myself devote some diligence and labor to the translation of this book. During that time I have applied my skill day and night to complete and publish the book for those living abroad who wish to gain learning and are disposed to living according to the law. Again, we go back to, this is a book of the diaspora, or a book for the diaspora. So, if we give some time after 132 as the date for the translation, then we go back to the actual writing, the date of writing. And most people would date, you just go back 2 generations, and we sort of settle on this date, 180 BCE. So it comes from the 2nd century BCE. There are a couple of indicators within the text. It mentioned that the book of Sirach mentions Simon the second, who reigned from, or who was the high priest from 220 to 204. So it couldn't have been written before this date. The other end of it, in terms of dating the original writing of this book, it is a little less firm, a little squishier in one sense, but that has to do with the fact that the book is very, very positive and upbeat, and does not indicate any of the persecutions that occurred under the reign of Antiochus IV. So, if he came to reign about 167, basically then this is the earliest it can be, and this is the latest date it can be. So here, just as an example in general of how we figure out dates for things when they don't actually give us dates, we have to take these clues from the context. So we settle on this date as being just sort of as good as any. So just to make one more comment about the book of Sirach itself, to talk about the copies of it. We do not have, for centuries, the only copies we had of Sirach were in the Greek. But in the 19th and 20th century, we have found Hebraic copies. So there is actual evidence of the original version in Hebrew. We found some among the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I also want to mention another, the Cairo Geniza, which Cairo Geniza. Geniza is a storeroom. Sometimes it's spelled with an H on the end. It's the Hebrew term for a storeroom within a synagogue. And within the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo, old Cairo, they discovered a storeroom full of ancient manuscripts. It's one of the largest collections of medieval manuscripts, of medieval Islamic manuscripts as well, or from the Islamic period. But anyway, we're going to come back to the Cairo Geniza because of the finds there that parallel the Dead Sea Scrolls. But in this Cairo Geniza, and let me take a step back and make a comment about scrolls. This is the era before books, before the binding of books. An actual book with pages in it, like we read today, is an invention of the Christian church, actually, to pass around books of the Bible. But originally, they were all these writings were on scrolls. And even in any form, books, whether they be made out of papyrus or leather or wood product, they are very fragile. And in the Hebrew tradition, once a scroll of the sacred scripture had been damaged, they had to be destroyed. So and this was kind of very much like how we today destroy, if an American flag is damaged, you might have seen going into Walmart or someplace a bin where you can return a damaged flag so that it can be burned. So you don't just throw away an American flag, and you didn't just throw away a copy of God's holy word. So they were damaged. There are rare instances, however, and this is where we get back to the Cairo Geniza, that instead of being destroyed, they were stored permanently in a storeroom. And this particular Geniza that I mentioned in Egypt has been just an amazing find for us in terms of some of the oldest manuscripts, various pseudepigraphical books and apocryphal books, and even copies of documents related to Qumran. So we'll get to that when we talk about Qumran. So, having had, and again, if there are any questions, but I wanted to make some broad statements about the theology of the book. And then we'll spend some time looking at examples and some of the important points of the book. So, the theology of Sirach, one, very much it reflects traditional wisdom, like I said already, very much like the book of Proverbs, very positive, all about giving advice for how to live a good life. So a wise man does this, a wise man does that. So traditional wisdom, advice about a good life, very much then itself contains advice in keeping with traditional wisdom, which is sort of about prudence and self-control and making good decisions and the art or the skill of living. But as I have already said, wisdom of the biblical period is has a lot in common with international wisdom. And so we have whole parts of the book of Proverbs that sound almost exactly like Egyptian documents of wisdom that we have found in Egypt. So this is the one place where Sirach diverges then from traditional wisdom, is to talk about how true wisdom, not just the general wisdom that works okay for the world, but true wisdom is uniquely Hebraic. Again, kind of repeating myself, but true wisdom is from Jerusalem, not from Athens. And so here we see Sirach in a much more positive way, engaging Hellenism and saying, hey, you guys are right. You guys are smart, you're wise, you have a lot of really good insight into reality and into the world, but really true wisdom is a bit deeper than that. So to sort of build off this idea of true wisdom as being Hebraic, I'm going to clear this page. So, but related to that idea of true wisdom found in Yahweh God, in the Hebrew God, the idea that wisdom is a gift. So there's a sense that wisdom is general revelation. You can see it in the world, but true wisdom is a gift that one gets from God. So it sort of straddles the line between wisdom as general revelation and wisdom as special revelation. The next point about this is the idea that wisdom, that the world that is the focus of wisdom thought is fundamentally a just place. Just, again, it's very positive, just or good. And that specifically it reflects divine glory. So when you, and again, we're talking about the Jewish God. So when you see this fundamental goodness of the world, fundamental justice found there, when you see how to live a good life, when you learn how to be skilled at living, what you are seeing is a reflection of Yahweh. That this indeed tells us not about the world in general, but about Yahweh God. So to move on from there, and I forgot what number I was on, but I also wanted to talk about how wisdom is equated very specifically or talked about in some specific ways that we'll explore a little further, but that it also tie wisdom to the Jewish God. And one is the equation of true wisdom with the Torah. True wisdom is the Torah. So the law or the instruction of God given at Mount Sinai becomes the highest form of true wisdom. And there's sort of an irony in there that to say that there is wisdom and then there is true wisdom, which is only known to those who learn and accept and practice the laws of the Torah and live in a covenant relationship with Yahweh God. It is also described as God's first creation. So the idea that before God created the world, God created wisdom, which is an interesting kind of concept, and we'll explore that a little bit. But before God created the world, he created wisdom. So wisdom is the first creation. And that, again, if that doesn't make full sense right now, I will be getting go a little more deeply into that. But also then the one final element of the theology of Ben Sira is sort of a natural outgrowth of the connection of wisdom with Yahweh and the Hebraic understanding of God and the covenant and all that. The phrase fear of the Lord is a major and important term in the book of Sirach. It occurs about 55 times in the book. Fear of the Lord, fear of the Lord. And the idea is, you may have in the past, just when you were younger, thought through what does it mean to fear God, and the translation into the English is a little misleading. For Sirach and in wisdom literature, when you see this phrase, what is the fear of the Lord? What is it? Wisdom. And how then do we fear the Lord? We act in obedience. So this phrase, fear of the Lord, the fear of the Lord is wisdom, and to be wise is to act in obedience to God. So again, to go back to the most original understanding of wisdom, the idea that creation, being skilled at living, is understanding the consequences of choices and making good choices and trying to be skilled at living. And so what Second Temple wisdom literature adds back in, particularly Sirach, is it's being skilled at living, but it's also following the Torah. So the fear of the Lord is making good choices based not only on a general understanding of how the world works, but following the Torah. So again, the idea that we see in a lot of wisdom literature in the Bible and outside, the pairing as the wise man versus the foolish man, now very clearly becomes the righteous versus the wicked. And I'll just point forward. Jesus himself was clearly a teacher of wisdom. It's one of the aspects of his teachings, because you can read the Gospels, this pairing of the righteous versus the wicked, or the wise versus the fool. And it's what he does with those pairings that uniquely displays his teachings. So now let us look at some elements, or I want to highlight some elements of the book. So I wanted to look at some specific elements. We've already looked at the prologue, so I won't repeat that, but I did want to add that Sirach's grandson knew his Greek, because it is in very good Greek prose, the original part of this, the part of the book of Sirach that is original to the translation, not the original book. Then I wanted to look at another major element of wisdom literature, but that is picked up in the book of Sirach, and that is woman wisdom. So just as an introduction, Chokmah is a feminine noun. You're also probably familiar with the Greek word for wisdom, which is also a feminine noun. The Greek word for wisdom, also a feminine noun, and the name of a goddess in the Egyptian pantheon. So, and you do get elements in Greek culture of wisdom as a goddess. So we find the idea of personifying wisdom in all of the ancient cultures of the time. So let me talk about the word personification. We see woman wisdom, the reference to woman wisdom, for the first time in Proverbs 1 through 9. We definitely understand that in Proverbs, this is a personification, meaning it is the process of taking an abstract idea and turning it into a person or so a modern example might be Lady Liberty or Lady Justice, with this, a woman with a blindfold, wearing, holding scales, and so Lady Justice. So this is the root of the idea, first in the larger culture of the ancient Near East, where the idea of a noun, a feminine noun, and the idea of a goddess of wisdom who is also female, but clearly that's not the case in the Hebrew literature. So it is a personification in this literature. So that's the background. So when we see when we see references to woman wisdom in Sirach, we can go straight back to Proverbs. But there's more to it in Sirach, and it becomes a really interesting concept, Lady Wisdom. And I will say also, because one of the things we're trying to do is to trace connections from the Old Testament through this literature into the New Testament. So I'm going to say this, and you'll just have to wait. When we get to Philo, who was a Jewish Egyptian of the diaspora, we get the idea of the Logos. Well, let me take a step back. We can go from Lady Wisdom or Chokmah, and I'll explain this later, to Philo, who referred to wisdom in the Greek with the word logos. So Philo translates the word wisdom as logos, and we can see then a direct development into the Gospel of John and Jesus as the logos. So there is something at stake even for interpreting the New Testament, to understand this transition from Proverbs to Sirach to Philo to the New Testament. So this is a little advertisement for when we get to Philo. Proverbs, it's mentioned in Sirach 14, starting in 20. Happy is the person, so we'll give you a chance to flip there. Sirach 14:20. Happy is the person who meditates on wisdom and reasons intelligently, who reflects in his heart on her ways and ponders her secrets. pursuing her like a hunter and lying in wait on her paths, who peers through her windows and listens at her doors, who camps near her house and fastens his tent peg to her walls, who pitches his tent near her and so occupies an excellent lodging place, who places his children under her shelter and lodges under her boughs, who is sheltered by her from the heat and dwells in the midst of her glory. And it goes on through the rest of actually through all of chapter 15. It goes on and on. So here again is what starts as a personification. You can see it clearly. We take the abstract idea of wisdom, and we want to talk about how important it is to be a wise man. Part of all of this traditional wisdom literature is to teach young men, in particular, how to grow up to be good adults, to be positive citizens of their community, to make the right choices so that they and their entire community flourish. And there's quite a period there when you're young when convincing a young man might not be that easy, to sort of put off the immediate gratification and make the wise choice, take the delayed gratification, take the route of delayed gratification. So it makes a lot of sense then, especially, we already have the basis of a feminine noun, to turn wisdom into a beautiful woman who a young man should desire like. So wisdom, it becomes something a man should desire as much as a man would desire a beautiful woman. That is the passion of the wise man, of being wise. One must be passionate about it. And so you can see how the personification works. All right. So I want to then spend a little time with chapter 24. So if you want to turn to chapter 24, this is another place where where we talk about woman wisdom. So chapter 24. Give you a few minutes to get there, a few seconds to get there, and I will turn there. This is a hymn of praise to wisdom. And your text actually says it right there at the top of chapter 24. The thing about chapter 24, although it's based on Proverbs 8, it seems more to describe wisdom as a woman in ways that are more intense than merely personification. And this gets us, again, we'll pick this back up again when we get to Philo. But one of the things that scholars who study this material, argue is that no longer is Lady Wisdom merely a personification of an abstract idea, but by the time we get to the Second Temple period, that wisdom is an hypostasis, which is a fancy word, and at least at first, it can be a little bit confusing. But the idea of an hypostasis in this sense is the idea of something that is of God, but in some ways separate from God. That has a separate existence. In the New Testament, hypostasis, something of God. So let me write that again, a hypostasis. Something that is a part of God, but has some form of a separate existence. So go back and read the beginning of the Gospel of John. This is the idea that stands behind the idea of Jesus as the Logos. In New Testament theology, the term hypostasis can apply to the Trinity. So the idea of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, that we but in the Hebrew thinking, it's a little bit more like the Logos, the idea that it has something that is God, but that we encounter in some form of a separate existence. Okay, please write down any questions, and I can elaborate on those in emails. So, the question then, well, let me read some of 24. Starting at the beginning of chapter 24, wisdom praises herself and tells of her glory in the midst of her people. In the assembly of the Most High she opens her mouth, and in the presence of his host she tells of her glory. And here, verse 3, I came forth from the mouth of God, a mouth of the Most High, and covered the earth like a mist. So there does seem to be the implication of a separate existence here, not just a personification. I dwelt in the highest heavens, and my throne was in a pillar of clouds. Alone I compassed the vault of the heavens and traversed the depths of the abyss. Let's go to verse 8 then. Just skip. Then the Creator of all things gave me a command. So again, more than a personification, perhaps. He said, and my Creator chose the path for my tent. He said, make your dwelling in Jacob, and in Israel receive your inheritance. So in this passage, again, serving the larger goal of Sirach, wisdom is set as a separate entity in some way, is told, wanders the whole world, and then is told to make it full residence in Jerusalem. So, and in Israel receive your inheritance. Before the ages, this verse 9, before the ages, in the beginning of, he created me. Okay, so let me finish this. I live in Israel. This reference to creation, the created, that wisdom is created by God. And it goes on, in the holy tent I ministered before him, and so I was established in Zion. Thus in the beloved city he gave me a resting place, and in Jerusalem was my domain. I took root in an honored people, in the portion of the Lord, his heritage. So wisdom has some form of separate existence. Verse 8, and going on from there, says that wisdom is told to live in Israel and is created by God. So it is God, and yet at the same time it has a separate existence. In verse 10, you essentially then, again, to finish this out, in the holy tent I ministered before him, and so I was established in Zion. Also in verse 23, all this is the book of the covenant of the Most High God, the law that Moses commanded us, congregations of Jacob. So in these two verses, the full implication of being commanded to live in Israel is that the Torah is a reflection, is wisdom. The books of the covenant. So there's the sense then that God takes a part of God's self, creates wisdom. It then has some form of separate existence. It wanders the world, it blesses the world, but then is commanded to live in Israel and Jerusalem, and the Jews then understand that the Torah is the very height of wisdom, the very essence of wisdom. Again, I wanted to say one more, and the chapter ends in verse 34. Observe that I have not labored for myself alone, but for all who seek wisdom. And there you have it. One must seek after wisdom like a beautiful woman who flourishes and who makes those around her flourish. And in doing so, one aligns oneself with the Torah, obedience to the Torah. So the idea then of Lady Wisdom, people will argue, is this just a very elaborate personification? Or indeed, are we seeing a full-blown understanding of wisdom in this understanding of wisdom is a hypostasis? It's an arguable point, but if it's an hypostasis anywhere, it is here. This is the clearest, or the one book of wisdom that leans the closest to this point of view. So again, arguable, but at the very least, if we don't want to accept that it is a full-blown hypostasis here, we can see and use Sirach as a touch point as we move forward into later Jewish writings and into the New Testament. I could also make a connection between this and the medieval Jewish mysticism known as Kabbalah, where it understands God as having 10 emanations. So there's this is a background for a lot of stuff. So write down any questions. I wanted to point out two more elements of Sirach that are important. One is the idea of the afterlife in Sirach. So you understand that that the traditional Jewish view did not accept an afterlife. There was no life after death in traditional Jewish understanding. But this is being translated, and it is for a world influenced by Hellenism, where there was an understanding of an afterlife. And so it's just worth pointing out that Sirach in 17, 27, and 28 clearly rejects any belief in an afterlife. So if you flip back to 17, and start in 27, who will sing praises to the Most High in Hades? Well, there's a Greek word for you. Who will sing praises to God in Hades? In place of the living who give thanks. In place of the living who give thanks. From the dead as from one who does not exist, thanksgiving has ceased. So, as from the dead as from one who does not exist. So, basically, there is no existence after death. Those who are alive and well sing the praises of the Lord. How great is the mercy of the Lord and his forgiveness for those who return to him. So again, that's another idea that I want to trace through this Second Temple period, is the understanding of what happens to a believer after he or she dies. Okay, then I want to look at one more section of Sirach, and that's starting in chapter 44 and running from there. So if you flip over to 44, I'm not going to go over this in depth, but I did want to point out a few things. But in 44, begins with this very famous phrase, "Let us now praise famous men," or sing the praises of famous men. One of the really fascinating elements of reading this ancient literature is, we know we've got the whole Old Testament in front of us. So we have a fair glimpse into who the famous men of this era might have been. Right? Because we don't know everything that they knew, but we know about all the ancestors and all the figures that have become so important in the Bible. And so who the author of Sirach, or who Sirach chooses to acknowledge, gives us some insight into who Sirach was and what kind of theology he represents, or group, whatever kind of group that he represents in his theology. So who does he talk about in this praise of famous men? So again, it would be very useful for you to just read over and just, maybe as you're reading, underline the people that he mentions and look at them, and think about all the other figures that could have been mentioned. So, but before I do that, I want to make one comment. The idea that you're praising famous men in a book of wisdom is another way of connecting wisdom with history and the covenant. Okay, so again, wisdom is found uniquely among the Jewish people and the Jewish ancestors, and the covenant community of God. Okay, so first, I want you to notice who's the first person that Sirach mentions. You've got Adam, you've got all sorts of figures, but he begins with Enoch. So the first man that we connect to wisdom through this praise of famous men is Enoch. And he pleased the Lord and was taken up. So this, again, all sorts of speculation about Enoch. And he was clearly a very, very popular in this figure. So, just again, a couple more elements. If there are any other unique elements you notice that you want to ask about. But Aaron is talked about a whole lot more than Moses. So Aaron is emphasized over Moses, which is certainly not the case in the written Bible, that or what we call the Old Testament. So Moses, this gives us a clear understanding of the connection of the author of Sirach and perhaps the whole wisdom tradition with the priesthood. So there probably was some form in Jerusalem, in some ways, there was some form of overlap with these wise men like Sirach and the priesthood. because that's the only way to explain why Aaron becomes more important than Moses. The Ezra is not mentioned at all. Which you'd think would be the case for this, that he would be mentioned. But it's postulated that Ezra himself was connected with a group of individuals who developed into the group that we know of as the Pharisees. So there is perhaps speculation that if we look at and we'll talk about these groups when we get to the New Testament, get to the groups of active in Judea in the Roman period, but you're familiar with these figures from the Gospels, that probably Sirach was more directly connected with the Sadducees, who were the priests, the elite, and the rich and powerful of Jerusalem. So he was definitely, there's a lot that would indicate that this was this elite, powerful group of educated men in Jerusalem, was the group that Sirach came from. The Praise of Famous Men ends with a reference to Simon, who is the high priest. We've mentioned him as one of the ways we date. And he reigned from 220 to 204. Again, when we get a bit closer to when we get to the section on the Sadducees and the the section on the Seleucids and the Hasmoneans, we'll spend some time elaborating on the high priesthood and Simon and why he was so important to certain groups. So in the end, the praise of famous men includes all sorts of people from all different aspects of Jewish history or of biblical history. Religious, prophetic, kings, high priests, and all that. So this hodgepodge of Jewish history equated with wisdom.